Welcome to our study of the Song of Songs, sometimes called the Song of Solomon. It was titled the Song of Songs as a Hebrew exaltation, that is, to the highest. It's a poetic lyric to the spiritual level. And so it was written about the 10th century BC as a Hebrew poem using the typical structures of Hebrew poems, that is, parallelism and metaphors and symbols. So much of this work is subject to interpretation. So we have to see, even in the author's background, his own life, that people have used that as a psychohistorical kind of development of his poem. He had 700 wives. I think one is enough, please. And so he was also not really married to some of them. He was unmarried to these women. He inherited mostly a harem, what we call a harem, from David. We see that background in 1 Kings 1 through 6. And so we sometimes see Solomon trying to say, well, how did I get into this? He has such a great perception about the art of love, and yet he doesn't know how to develop relationships well. And so he's bemoaning that. And I think this Song of Solomon is a way of his kind of working through his growing from youth to old, mature age, seeing how love has changed his life. So I think this theme basically is a search for what we call an ideal relationship. And so he has a development of a courtship to marriage in his wedding song. And so there's a celebration, a praise of human love. But it's also what we call a didactic teaching, a moral teaching about relationships between men and women, God's people, and how to conduct a proper marriage. So there are different commentaries and different interpretations. Some of these alternate interpretations are based upon different approaches. The first approach is called allegory. It was developed by Al Gore. No, that's a joke. He invented the internet. An allegory is a message that concerns the development and the history of Israel, its people, and their relationship to God. In other words, it's sort of a story. It's a narration, but it's telling us a message underneath this allegory. A second approach is what we call typology. And I'm very influenced by this, as most classical people are in the church. The historical actuality of the development of Israel and the church. In other words, there are types that he mentions here. So the bridegroom is going to be seen as a Christian, as Jesus Christ. The bride will always be the church. And so a third approach might be what we call a mythological approach. Not that it's a lie, but that it has been based upon early historical beliefs, cultural beliefs of myths, especially in the gods and goddesses. And so there's many commentators that say, well, he's just reinforcing some of the relationships of the early priests and the priestesses, especially when they went wrong in their sexual relationships. This was occurring in Canaan. There were many fertility rites and cults going on. They used what we call sympathetic magic. For example, the god Tammuz and the goddess Ishtar would have these kinds of fertility rites, and they were blossoming in fertility, and even the fertility of birth was given to them in the rites of spring and in the resurrection. And so many people see that theme in Solomon's work here in uh, the Song of Songs, but I think there's a deeper meaning to it. And then, of course, I like the literal interpretation because I am a fundamentalist. I still put the fun back into the mental. And so the literal interpretation is that this is simply a book of love poetry. You know, if you want to have a good relationship with your spouse, then read them the book of Solomon. And so you can have this insight into human love, but also I think it's much more than that. It's a way to understand why we were created to love one another as Jesus first loved us. And so there are different, again, approaches to how you interpret the Song of Solomon. They've tried to make sense of that, having a narration about a story. And so some people just give up and say there's no coherent story in here. It's poetry, it's only images. Or some people take what we call the three character view, and that is the shepherd hypothesis. Interesting. Solomon sees this beautiful girl, the Shunammite woman, who loved a shepherd boy, and he desired her. But nevertheless, she was in love with the shepherd. So he finally lets go of her after he tries his best to snatch her away with this invitation of this beautiful language to her and poem reading to her. And then she ultimately returns back to her first love, the shepherd boy. So the three are in what we would call a love triangle today. That's why it's called the three character view. The two character view just simply says it's an illustration of the relationship of Solomon with a country girl that he meets in the mountains or in the hills, and he's trying to win her over, and he's doing this because of his own many failures in marriages and in love. And so he's searching for love in all the wrong places, but he tries to find a better love. So my interpretations of this poem is indicated often when I write this in parentheses because I want people to know that these are my personal interpretations. But they're based upon my messianic background, my interpretation from the perspective of a Christian that uses the whole counsel of the Bible. It's not the only possible interpretation since it's poetry. And that's subject always to different philosophies, worldviews, and alternatives, and sometimes just emotional inspiration. But in my opinion, I have looked at this based upon the whole inspired, inerrant Word of God in the Bible as a Christian believer. So as we go through the book of Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, we will see in chapters 2 and 3 what we can study